Hey there again, this is Mr. Hefner, and this is going to be our introduction to two pieces this week. We're going to take a look at Do Not Weep, Maiden, for War is Kind, a poem by Stephen Crane, and we're also going to take a look at another poem by Stephen Crane, A Man Said to the Universe. Now, this particular presentation is actually titled An Introduction to, but it has everything you need in it. These poems are short, and so I've included them right here in this presentation. We'll talk about them as we go along, and then I have the check for understanding questions at the end. And as always, as this is a video, remember that you can pause it to take notes or go back over something that you need to reflect a little bit more on. So our lesson essential question for today is going to be, what do these poems comment on the period of the Civil War? In other words, what are they saying about the time period? Now, as I mentioned before, Stephen Crane was actually born after the Civil War is over, and I don't believe for that reason he belongs in this unit. Much of what he wrote about was the Civil War, because I think that probably dominated American culture for at least 50 years afterwards, and definitely during the period of Reconstruction. Now, if we were in class, there would be a discussion question for today, and that would be, what would you do to comfort someone who had lost a loved one? And by this point in high school, I'm sure every one of you has known someone who has passed, or you've had a friend who's known someone who's passed. And there's always that difficult time of wanting to say the right thing, wanting to comfort them, and yet, do words ever really comfort somebody in such a loss? And yet we go on doing it. So Stephen Crane is going to, in these two poems, he's going to show us some of that naturalism that we've talked about before. And there is definitely some irony in what he's going to say. But who was this guy, Stephen Crane? So as I said before, he was born after the Civil War. The Civil War ended in 1865. Most people consider April 9th, 1865, the day that Robert E. Lee surrendered his army to General Grant, to be the end of the war. Some battles went on after that. There were other armies still fighting. Those were just the two main armies of the North and the South. But Stephen Crane came afterwards in 1871, so we're looking at 6 years after the Civil War is over. He's born, and he's clearly not writing until he's a young adult. Some things about his biography, not that it matters. He was born in New Jersey. That's kind of unusual. Most of the people that we've had so far were born somewhere in New England. He was the youngest of 14 children. So you can be surprised at the size of the family, but keep in mind, one of the things that often happens with families is as they have more and more children, obviously more and more time has passed, and younger children tend to be raised more by their older siblings than they are by their parents, because they have older siblings who, in fact, if there are 14 children, the oldest sibling could probably be the parent of the youngest child by that point. And in Stephen Crane's case, he had lost his father at a very young age, so I'm sure these older siblings were really important in his life. He attended Syracuse University. He did not get a degree from Syracuse, but he got an education there, and I'm sure he carried something on. He was very literate, and of course, like many people of the time period, newspapers provided a great way for writers to make a living. There were thousands and thousands of newspapers across this country. Many of them competed through something called yellow journalism, which is today what we would call fake news. But they stretched the truth, and they wrote really exaggerated and almost hysterical stories. But they also sent reporters out around the country. This was a period of time when Americans were starting to learn what the other parts of the United States were really like. And Stephen Crane served as a reporter in Mexico, the American West, and even down in Florida. Now today we think of Florida as a resort area. Florida was really a swampy wilderness at that time. It was only after the railroads went to Florida and the city of Miami was created that it started to develop into a place where people went to vacation. Stephen Crane also, you don't need to remember the wars, but he also served as a war reporter for the Greco-Turkish War, which obviously was in Greece and Turkey, and the Spanish-American War, which happened down mostly in Cuba, but throughout the Spanish colonies that were in that area. He traveled to England, and he met the greatest British writers of the time. H.G. Wells, one of the world's First and foremost science fiction writers, Joseph Conrad, Henry James. You don't need to remember the names, just understand that Stephen Crane did some traveling. And he's best known, his works are The Red Badge of Courage, which is a story about the Battle of Chancellorsville. Even though Chancellorsville is not specifically mentioned anywhere in the story, we know by the events going on that that's what it is. The Blue Hotel and The Open Boat, which are both short stories. Now, Stephen Crane is a determinist. That is a philosophy, and this is the time in this unit where we're really going to start to talk about determinism and naturalism. Now, a determinist is someone who adopts a philosophy that human beings aren't in control of everything in their life. Stuff happens to us, and we're just a part of nature. Naturalists are writers who are really determinists in their philosophy. So if you're talking about the belief and the philosophy, you're a determinist. If you're writing in a style that shows your determinist beliefs, you're writing in a literary style called naturalism. So for the most part, those words are going to be interchangeable unless you see the word philosophy included in the sentence, and then determinist would be the preferred word for that. And like so many people in the last unit and this unit, Stephen Crane finally met his end of tuberculosis. There it is again, the dreaded scourge known as the consumption. And he died of tuberculosis when he was in Germany. Now, the first poem that we're going to take a look at today is Do Not Weep, Maiden, for War is Kind. And you can tell by that last part of that title, for war is kind, there is going to be dramatic irony in this. And that black and white image you see on your screen right now is a picture of some of the dead lying on the field at Gettysburg, killed on the first day of the battle. The photograph was probably taken a few days later because photographers were not on the battlefield setting up their cameras during the Battle of Gettysburg. This poem is written in a free verse style. Now, we're going to talk about free verse a little bit later in this unit when we get to Walt Whitman, who really pioneered free verse in America. But free verse is a type of poetry that does not require a specific meter. Most of the time, it doesn't have any meter at all, no rhythm to it, and also doesn't have a rhyme scheme. Sometimes not a regular rhyme scheme, sometimes not any rhyme scheme at all. And we've already talked about naturalism. So we're going to look at the naturalism in this piece of looking at the idea that life happens and we are just cogs in the machinery. The literary tools, again, we've touched on a few of these already. One of them is going to be dialogue. Dialogue, you know, that is when two or more voices in a piece are speaking together. We think of it mostly in a play or in a short story or a novel, but we also have dialogue in poetry, and that's what we're going to see today. Then there's free verse, and free verse is that poetry that avoids the regular use of rhyme, meter, or division into stanzas, which I hadn't mentioned before. And finally, irony. And I don't think you ever talk about literature, especially American literature, without bringing the word irony into this. The basic definition of irony is a terrible definition. It's the difference between appearance and reality, but there's always an extra twist to irony, and we'll look at that. We'll talk about that as we go through the first poem, which we're going to do right now. So let's take a look at the first poem, which is called Do Not Weep, Maiden, for War is Kind, by Stephen Crane. And you're going to find that line in the poem. Now, this poem has a speaker, as all poems do, addressing three different audiences. The first is going to be the maiden. The second is going to be a child, or a child of a Civil War soldier. And the third is going to be the mother of that Civil War soldier, all who lose somebody after a battle. So here's the poem. Do not weep, maiden, for war is kind, because your lover threw wild hands toward the sky, and the affrighted steed ran on alone. Do not weep, war is kind. Hoarse, booming drums of the regiment, little souls who thirst for fight. These men were born to drill and die. The unexplained glory flies above them. Great is the battle god, great, and his kingdom a field where 1,000 corpses lie. So these are the first two stanzas of the poem, and of course you can see the irony in this, the idea that do not weep, war is just doing what war is supposed to do. This is all part of the plan. And if you lost your young man, your beau, your husband, whatever, it's because that's the rules. That's the way life is. And he's only doing what he was born to do, fight in battle and die. These are words no one wants to hear. All right, let's look at the next part of the poem. In the next part, the speaker is going to address the child. Do not weep, babe, for war is kind. Because your father tumbled in the yellow trenches, raged at his breast, gulped and died, do not weep, war is kind. Swift blazing flag of the regiment, eagle with crest of red and gold, these men were born to drill and die. Point for them the virtue of slaughter, make plain to them the excellence of killing, and a field where 1,000 corpses lie. All right, two more stanzas, more irony, sarcasm if you will, the same line, do not weep for war is kind. Look at this one here addressing the child. Don't be sad that you lost your dad. He's just dying because that's what he was born to do. And the second stanza on this page, I think sort of makes fun, pokes fun, criticizes, whatever you want to say, the idea of how we glorify war. We put on beautiful uniforms with gold buttons and epaulets. We wear red sashes. We dash into battle with music playing. And what does it come to? Slaughter, and again that final line, a field where 1,000 corpses lie. All right, here's the final part of the poem. In the final part of the poem, the speaker is addressing the mother of the dead soldier. Mother whose heart hung humble as a button on the bright, splendid shroud of your son, do not weep, war is kind. All right, mothers obviously support their children. They're proud of them when they go off to war. But look at that middle line there, the bright, splendid shroud. A shroud is the wrapping that we put around a dead body before we bury it. It's usually white, it shines in the sunshine, it's bright and it's splendid, and yet this mother's child is dead and is going into a grave. But don't weep. Just remember, war is kind. All right, that's the first Stephen Crane very dark poem. The second one is super short, and the second was not as dark, but the irony and the message behind it is pretty powerful for such a short poem. It's called A Man Said to the Universe, and the poem goes, A man said to the universe, "Sir, I exist." "However," replied the universe, "the fact has not created in me a sense of obligation." Now that's a really unusual poem. If this poem had been composed during the Civil War period, many people who studied literature wouldn't have even recognized it as a poem. But remember, Stephen King is writing this years after the Civil War era, and free verse has become fashionable by this time. It's become the literary way of composing poetry. But look at the absolute sarcasm. A man stands up and says to the universe, "Notice me, here I am." And the universe kind of says, "Yeah, so what? That doesn't mean you deserve or that you're getting anything." This again is pure naturalism, or if you prefer, determinism. All right, let's go over the checking for understanding questions. Remember, these are the same questions that could appear on any check for understanding. They may even show up on a unit test. You can add them to any Cornell notes that you're taking. And if this presentation goes too fast for you, remember, there's a pause button. Use it. All right, here's the first question. The maiden's lover threw wild hands toward the sky. Why? Yeah, as he died. As he's been shot, as he's been wounded in some way, he throws his hands up, arches his back, and falls to the ground. It's quite an image. Why are the maiden the baby, and the mother told, I'm sorry, I said that wrong. What are the maiden, the baby, and the mother told about the men that they love? They were born to drill and die. This is determinism. Why are they here? To fulfill their destiny. What is their destiny? To die in battle. All right, let's take a look at some sentence completions. We've got, these are mostly literary terms that we're going to work with here. Number one, poetry that does not use regular rhyme, rhythm, meter, or stanzas. What is that known as? Yes, that is free verse. Number two, much of Stephen Crane's work was influenced by the philosophy of. Now there are two answers to choose from up there that work pretty well, but there's one that's a better answer because of that word philosophy. And that's right, it's determinism. If we see the word philosophy, determinism is the philosophy. Naturalism is the style of writing with a perspective of the philosophy of determinism. Number three, the phrase war is kind is an example of what? Verbal irony. Verbal irony is a type of irony where what we mean is the opposite of what we say. It sounds like sarcasm. If you're wearing the ugliest shirt I've ever seen, and I would never say this to you, but if you're wearing the ugliest shirt I've ever seen and I say, that's a really nice shirt, you probably know what my true meaning is. Number four, what argues that human beings do not control their own choices or actions, but instead are helplessly controlled by outside forces? All right. This is one of those where it doesn't mention a writing style and it doesn't mention philosophy, so either naturalism or determinism would be correct here. Now, I didn't write these questions. These are the ones from your textbook. And I promise you, if this shows up on a check for understanding or if this shows up on a unit test, I'll clarify the question a whole lot better than this. Number five, what is a difference between appearance and reality? This is that terrible definition for the word irony. Yeah. Irony is one of those things you have to recognize it. You have to see it to know it. And putting a definition in words always falls short. It's more of a concept. All right, next one. What is in the kingdom of the battle god? And if you missed this one, you weren't paying attention. Corpses. Yeah, it is the field where 1,000 corpses lie. Which of the following lines illustrates alliteration? Mother whose heart hung humble as a button, on the bright splendid shroud of your son, do not weep, or war is kind. Again, I didn't write this question, and I think somebody at the textbook publisher missed something important. They want you to pick number or letter A because they saw heart hung humble. That's alliteration. But guess what? Splendid shroud sun is also alliteration. So I would take either one of these answers, and if this were my question, I would write it to be more specific. So heart hung humble, that's alliteration, and splendid shroud and sun, because it has that sibilant sound. S. Which of the following lines illustrates simile? Mother whose heart hung humble as a button, on the bright splendid shroud of your son, do not weep, or war is kind. And the correct answer here would be mother whose heart hung humble as a button. How do we know that's a simile? Humble as a button uses that as. And remember, similes always use the word as or, yeah, you got it, like. As or like. Which of the following lines illustrates imagery? So imagery is painting a picture of what things look like, smell like, taste like in some occasions. Which one fits best? Mother whose heart hung humble as a button, on the bright splendid shroud of your son, do not weep, or war is kind. And again, If that sun is wrapped in the death garments, it's going to be a bright white sheet shining in the sun, and bright, splendid shroud is a pretty dark image for being so bright. And last of all, make sure that by the end of this unit, you can answer the question, what is naturalism? And again, naturalism is a writing style driven by the philosophy of determinism, and that means that it is going to portray people as not being in control of the things that happen in their lives. People are just a part of nature, and what's going to happen in nature is going to happen in nature. All right, so that's the end of this presentation. Be sure to check Schoology. You may find that there are other tasks you're expected to complete today. I thank you for staying with me through the entire thing, and I hope to see you in class soon.